Welcome back to the conversation we're having with the legendary Dr. Raymond Moody. In my line of work, I've had the honor of hanging out with and conversing with quite a few legends in the consciousness space. Raymond and I had never met before, and I got to tell you, I was truly excited to finally get to meet him. In my estimation, he's one of the most interesting, inspired, and unassuming people I think I've ever had the pleasure to have met. His accomplishments are nothing short of incredible. His writings and research inspirational. His wisdom and humility, for me, are exemplary. If you're a fan of his writings, you're going to love the wisdom he's about to share with you. On a personal note, it's not lost on me how blessed I am to be sitting in this seat and getting to know these people. As you well know, many podcast interviews are short and sweet. The guests come on to get the message out about the work that they're presenting to the world. And of course, I see nothing wrong with that. And I make sure to ask the questions that allow that work to be represented and shared. These people are very busy doing their work and they have little time for promoting it, so they make it count. That said, as host of this podcast, I strive to ask questions that allow for you, the listener, to get to know more about these people as people. Exceptional people in every respect due to their work, and people nonetheless. People who are inquisitive, people who are hardworking, diligent, very knowledgeable in their fields, and at the same time, still growing, still learning, in every respect, very human, and representing something that we all long to know, which is, what does it mean to be human? What is the meaning behind life, experience, and consciousness? What is the nature of consciousness? Raymond Moody offers a lot to these questions and the conversation of consciousness in general. But he does so with such grace and humility that for me, it brings a light that shines brightly in the conversation. Raymond Moody knows on a very deep level, to quote Ram Dass, that we're all just walking each other home. We still have a lot to learn on this journey. So there's a lot to consider as you take in this conversation as it unfolds. We enjoyed our first hour so much that Raymond actually consented to meet with me a second time. Again, I'm honored. So buckle up, pull up a favorite beverage, and prepare to be amazed at the wisdom you are about to hear. Wisdom coming from a man who spent his entire life in service to the unfolding story of consciousness. Here's part 2 of my conversation with Dr. Raymond Moody.
I mean, I really do say, Mark, this is something I really say sincerely. I'm tired of Raymond Moody. Mm-hmm. And I've been saying that for about 10 years. When I say that to my audiences, the people my age, smile and they'll kind of unconsciously nod. Like, yeah, me too. I'm tired of myself. But the young people, they screw up their faces. He must be depressed or what. No, but it's a great liberation to be, disabused of the notion that I've never had very high self-esteem, but I'm glad. I want to keep it, as low as possible. Because ego is the problem. See, what I realized is my ego trip was jealousy, and it seemed so real when I was out in it. But when you get out of it, you realize it was just kind of a delusion, right? And so what I've determined is one ego trip is enough. If you really study your ego trip, you don't need any more of them. But I think maybe you need at least one in life to get this place interesting. I'm not sure about that, but it seems like it's a good tool for self-understanding to have ego trip.
Yeah, I get that. You have to have some sense of self and other, subject, object, to have any experience at all. And I guess that makes an ego, right?
Don't you think the older you get, I mean, it seems to me like I've kind of partly figured it out with my intellect, but I think these distinctions are kind of faulty in some way. And it sounds like a ego, the like ego to say we're all kind of God. But I think, you know, and that does sound egotistic and all, but I think, no, I think there's a certain reality to it. Was it Meister Eckhart?
Mm-hmm.
I can't quite remember the saying, but it's the eyes with which I see God are the same eyes
Mm-hmm.
with which God sees me.
Mm-hmm. And comes to know God.
Yeah.
I once met a woman at the Monroe Institute who had an NDE. I've only met 2 people in my life who have had one. One was a remote viewer who became talented after his experience and in psychic ability, and the other was just a woman who had the experience. A classic NDE, but with a mild difference. And that difference was she had left her body, saw what was going on in the operating room, could report all the things and remember the experience, went through the tunnel, approached the light, and there was what she perceived as the glory of heaven and a concept of God. Although she saw no one, it was just a wonderful white light that just enveloped her and made her feel just beyond ecstatic. And she was so happy to be there. And she said, I shouted mentally, I'm here. And she heard, great. And she just basked in the light of the Shekinah, the Holy Spirit, and stayed there for an inordinate amount of time, which could have been, I don't know, 1 second to 100 million years.
1 billion years.
Right.
That's right. Yeah.
And then finally, she felt as if she needed to go back. She couldn't really understand why, but she needed to return. She spoke to no one, and she said, I'm leaving. And the response was, great. It was almost dispassionate. There was no life review. And I could really resonate with that experience because of my concepts of a dispassionate deity. All right.
Ah, interesting.
I wondered if you have ever run across other experiences along that line, and do these near-death experiences reflect something that's already contained within the psyche of the individual with regards to their understanding of deity?
Wonderful. Well, the answer is I don't know, right? However, the more extended answer is I have thought a lot about that.
Right.
To go back to that woman's wonderful vision there, that phrase beatific vision comes to my mind,
right.
Mark. Mm-hmm. And that's what, from my limited knowledge of, the terminology of mysticism, that's where I would think that would belong, is the beatific vision.
I agree.
And in terms of this notion of deity as dispassionate, and to what degree that is reflected in the near-death experiences I've heard, I think the sum and summation of it, so to speak, just listening to all these thousands of people talking to me in my mind, as they still do, I think that it is both dispassionate because knowledge-based. That is, this being just tells the truth.
Yeah, there you go.
Right?
Right.
And at the same time, people say that, this being has a sense of humor too, and is very loving. So there is that combination in God is not too surprising, the dispassionate compassion. I mean, maybe somebody like St. Augustine would have put that as a dispassionate compassion or something.
Right. I didn't mean to imply unloving.
I know you did. That's exactly what I mean too. It's like, that never entered my mind that you would think that. But what I mean is that it's the dispassionate part is the complete penetrating knowledge.
Yes.
Right. And then the compassionate side of it comes into application. And
right.
God has been very humorous with me in my life. You're too young to remember, Mark, but when I was, and I've told you the story already, please stop me, but back in the early 50s, television was brand new and people didn't understand the impact of it. There was not even a glimmer.
Right.
And two of the well-known TV celebrities everybody knew, Arthur Godfrey and Gary Moore. And Arthur Godfrey had a sort of entertainment plus commentary show during the day. And Gary Moore was the host of I've Got a Secret, a game show.
Okay.
And Gary Moore had a crew cut and his hair stood straight up, right? And on Arthur Godfrey's midday show, Gary Moore was the guest.
Okay.
And Gary Moore told this story. And as he told this story, his hair, the fact that his eyes were so huge, widened with incomprehension as it was, has made the hair standing straight up on his head more accentuated, right? But he was telling the story of how just a short while before he had been out to the marina where he kept his boat, right? And so he said, walking up into the marina, he saw this complete stranger walking around on the deck of his boat.
Mm-hmm.
And he was just aghast and came up there and he said, this guy, stranger, bounced down from the boat, grabbed his hand, pumped it, and said, hi, Gary, how you doing? I watch you on TV all the time. I heard this is your boat. And Gary, that's something you and I understand, right? But which people in TV at the time didn't have the perspective yet to understand. To him, it was horrifying and baffling.
Right.
And at that moment, I had this thought, oh, my God, what a terrible thing it would be to be famous, was my thought. Mm-hmm. And then this presence came, which I now recognize as the presence of God. It's because now I know the situation. I get it now. But then it was just this presence.
Right.
But the thought something was not in any hostile way, but just rather it's like, how interesting.
Right. Curious.
Right. That's right. Let's see was the idea. Let's see, or something like that. And but then it happened some years later, and it was just as horrifying as I had imagined. And also that what a great opportunity. You meet people you never would have met otherwise. And, so it's just been a fascinating trip. But that was, I guess, the first time I remember feeling that touch of God.
Yeah. Well, I'm very curious to know, have you ever had a near-death experience, or is your connection with divinity, God, we'll call it, predicated on other like-kind experiences?
Well, I came very close to death, but I like to say I got to where I could see the city limit sign, but I didn't have the panoply that we usually associate with it. But when I heard George Ritchie speak, then I felt divinity at that point. I mean, I just his description of his amazing, encounter it just sort of came through. And I think I mentioned to you years later, I found out that I'd been there in utero. Did I mention that?
No, you didn't. Well, you want to tell this story?
Yeah, well, George Ritchie was from Richmond, Virginia. Okay. And I met him when he was a professor of psychiatry at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville in 1965. And I am from Porterdale, Georgia, which is where my parents are from. Okay. And so George Ritchie's experience took place on December 24th, I believe it was, 1943 at Camp Barkley, Texas, where he had been a recruit into the Army.
Okay.
And he talked about the doctor said, that at least for 9 minutes, because they don't know how long it was since he had been in this state before they found him, but at least 9 minutes he was without heartbeat. And so this Dr. Francie, his name was, resuscitated George against his own better judgment. Actually, it was the ward boy. It was a long story, but But I had this amazing experience that touched my life. So then I began to hear I heard a couple of other cases when I was an undergraduate. Then when I was a philosophy professor, from my colleagues and my students, I heard these stories. Then medical school, I heard a lot of stories. And so, then my book I wrote in 1974, it was published in 75.
Mm-hmm.
The only contact I'd had with George in all that time was that when the book was in press, I called him, asked him if I could dedicate the book to him. Then that was November of 75.
Mm-hmm.
Then in January of 76, I graduated from medical school. In March of 76, I was a medical student in Georgia at the Medical College of Georgia. But I decided to go back to Charlottesville for my residency in psychiatry. Mm-hmm. So I went to Charlottesville in March of 76 to interview for my residency position.
Okay.
And while I was there, just called up Dr. Ritchie and we're in town. He's so nice, invited us over to dinner and so on. Then the next day, went back home to Macon, Georgia, where my parents lived, taking care of my kids. Okay. And so I just mentioned to Dad that, the day before I'd been with this Dr. Ritchie, who was the first living person I heard this story from. Mm-hmm. And by then, my dad had heard a tape of George's experience. And my father said the following words. I remember immediately because by that time, I understand from my psychiatry training that telegraphic speech, where you sound like you're a telegram,
right.
is a sign of anxiety.
Okay.
So my father said the following things. He said, he said, George Ritchie, Camp Barkley, Texas, December 1943. I was there. And so were you. And Dad explained to me that he and Mom had gone to Camp Barkley, Texas from Porterdale in early September 1943 so that Dad go to officers candidate school. I was conceived in late September 1943. George's experience was December 24th, 1943. And Mom and Dad moved away from Camp Barkley on December 29th, 1943.
5 days later.
Yeah.
You were there in that short window. What are the
I was
odds?
in there, from sometime in September when I was conceived. I was there, right there at Camp Barkley.
What are all this odds?
I know. I mean, it's just absolutely beyond. Mark, I am from a law enforcement family. My uncle was the chief law enforcement officer of this little community in Georgia for 30 years. Mm-hmm. When they retired, they had to hire 3 officers to take his place. So when I was a kid, it's law enforcement. And my brother, 2 uncles, 2 cousins. And so my uncle was driving me around in the country on his, I rode a lot. And so out of the middle of nowhere, we saw this old grist mill.
Okay.
And I immediately thought, oh my God, what a place to live that would be. Something came over me. Mm-hmm. All right. So for several summers thereafter, I kept looking around, but I found quickly that they're few and far between and people don't want to sell them. Right. So I had given that up. Now, flash forward, I was in late 80s, I was a professor of psychology at West Georgia University in Carrollton, Georgia. Mm-hmm. And when I came up with this psychomanteum thing, the study of the ancient Greek techniques for evoking the deceased and so on, this was 89. And I knew enough about it that I knew I needed to do some research on it. But just by the nature of it, it needs to be someplace out in the country. Right, where a rural setting to create the atmosphere and all. So started looking all around there, but quickly realized that was under the real estate sphere of Atlanta. So it was just too much for me. All right. So I was kind of discouraged. And in November of 89, I went into the office of the psychology department secretary, Nancy Gillespie was her name. And she said, Raymond, we're just 11 miles from Alabama. She said, I'm from over there. She said, over there, the real estate, you just wouldn't believe. She said, you just go look over there. So ask another friend of mine who was a real estate agent who had lived in Alabama, was from there. Said, can you find me a place over in Alabama? And she said, well, I'll look. But I never said anything about an old mill, right? That was all I said. A country, it had to be within a certain number of miles that I could get back and forth.
Right.
So in January of 90, she called me and said, Raymond, can you go to Alabama? Oh, sure. I didn't know where we're going. Got in the car. On the way out there, she said she chose this place because her son's best friend was the local sheriff in this county. Right. So anyway, he had volunteered to take us around the county that day. And just he had read my books and such. So went out there and saw this beautiful little Victorian cottage. Oh, that's really neat. And so Kirk Moore, the real estate agent, was the guy on the real estate side, right? And the sheriff knew Kirk. And he said, well, I know Kirk. Let's go to his office right now. So I said, hello, how are you? And, that little Victorian cottage you have for sale. He said, what are you looking for? And I said, well, I'm a psychiatrist. I'm looking for a place out in the country to do some research and writing. And he said, looking over, he said, let me take you by this place near where I live. Drove along this country road down to an old mill. I swear to God, absolutely. I swear to God. And so he said, well, the trouble is it's not for sale. But then he turned around. This was before the cell phone, right? So he said, we got to go back to my office. He was going to call. And he said, really, the old couple who live in it, they don't want to move. But he said, I know their children have all moved away now to town. And their children are worried about them living out there in the wilderness. So that's the situation. So back to his office in my presence, called Miss Door. There's this man coming from out of town. Can I see his place? I heard, you can't, Kirk, but we're not going to sell our, and so came in. How are you, Miss Door? Raymond Moody. Raymond Moody. Are you the man that wrote that book? And so led me to her bookshelf and got out George Ritchie's book, to which I had written the foreword, and opened it up and saw the sweet dedication from George to my dear friends, the Doors. And she said, well, Dr. George Ritchie is a dear, dear friend of ours.
Oh, my God.
This must be a sign.
You think?
So that's how I got the middle, or how God, arranged the situation.
God works in mysterious ways.
Absolutely.
And synchronicity abounds. That is just a fantastic story.
Well, it happened.
And it's a perfect segue into the psychomanteum experiments that you did. I wanted to clue the audience in on these experiments. For the benefit of those who know nothing about a psychomanteum, why not take a moment to describe that?
Sure. All of my friends who are, hang around me a lot know me to be a bore, because there are not many subjects that I use. One is astronomy, and another is ancient Greek philosophy. And that is the most astounding, unbelievable story of history. And it's all of the stuff we have now, this whole structure we're in, came from these 20 or so guys in ancient Greece. That's the fact. And now we're not supposed to acknowledge that, You're too young to remember, I guess, but when I was a kid, it was the classical education, the basic classics. That's what everybody read.
The Republic, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
And so that story is so incredible because you cannot understand how we got to be the people we are and to have the system of logic and thinking that we do unless you take into account these institutions in ancient Greece, which were called oracles of the dead, where these places you would go, and this is historic.
Mm-hmm. You're talking about the Pythia at the Temple of Delphi.
That's right. That one was kind of a fortune teller or a life guidance oracle, where the oracles of the dead were specific purpose was to evoke the spirit of your dead friends or associates or whatever.
In the necromantion.
That's right. That's right.
Mm-hmm.
And there were 4 or 5 of them. Every one of them more fantastic than the previous one. I mean, it's just the stories were eventually discounted because who can believe?
Right.
So in Herodotus, for example, the historian, he talks about this institution, the Oracle of the Dead, among the Thesprotians on the river Acheron, he said. And he talks about this king who sent a delegation up there to ask a question of his dead wife, Melissa. Mm-hmm. And so I remember reading that and thinking, I was 18 years old at that time and far more omniscient than I am now. Right. I mean, my respect for Herodotus was great, but, this is impossible.
A bridge too far, right?
That's right. So anyway, and also, see, and if you go back to Plato's time even, if you ask this person on the street in Athens, what is a philosopher? He'd say, well, a philosopher is a person who probes into things up in the air. Okay. And this meant magical flight, like getting out of your body. And Aristophanes made fun of Socrates as up in the air in a little balloon in the clouds, right? And also Aristophanes made fun as the other side of it was he probes into things up in the air or down under the earth, which was a code for the next life, or they located the afterlife world was down under.
Right. Okay. The realm of Hades.
That's right. And so the people who lived there at this place, Cape Cimmerian, by ancestral custom, Strabo, the geographer, tells us that by ancestral custom, these evokers of the dead lived under the ground during the day and did not come out during the day.
Really?
Only came out at night.
Okay.
And this makes sense against the shamanic background. In some shamanic cultures that's done, right? The shaman has to stay in the blight-proof hut, right? And this was a similar thing. Apparently it would enable them to enter into altered states more, easily.
Okay.
Yeah, so, this was just built into people regarded philosophers as one of the things they did was to deal with the afterlife. Empedocles is noted for calling up the dead. Parmenides went on a voyage to the underworld to get the notion of truth and bring it back to us as logic, all of these things. So this Greek philosophy is ultimately tied into these oracles of the dead. So back in about 1985, I guess, or somewhere in there, I had been reading about crystal gazing from the point of view of psychology. It's a remarkable fact that when people gaze into an optical depth, it doesn't have to be a crystal ball. It can be your fishbowl, right? Or a clear pond like the Cherokees used, or a mirror like the Aztecs used obsidian mirrors. But to gaze into a surface where you seem to see through the surface brings about visions in many people. So
that's amazing. I have so many questions around that, and I will ask them right after the break. We'll be back with Dr. Raymond Moody in just a minute.
Expanding on Consciousness is brought to you by the Monroe Institute, a nonprofit organization and leader in consciousness education and research, teaching you how to actively explore and use expanded states of consciousness, providing direct experiences that are deeply personal, uniquely meaningful, and life-changing. Monroe has been helping people create more meaningful and joyful lives through the guided exploration of expanded consciousness for 50 years. Gain the knowledge and understanding you seek to create the life you desire. Learn more about where to start your journey to expanded awareness with Monroe. Visit monroeinstitute.org or check out our Expand Meditation app, available on the App Store or Google Play.
Is this the same type of phenomenon that was used at SRI with regards to the Ganzfeld effect using white noise? Because human beings have a tendency to create order out of chaos on a subconscious level, and that seems to stimulate some psychic effect?
That's interesting, Mark, but I don't, I think from my experience, this is a little different because
Okay.
I've guided a lot of people through the mirror gazing. And I found when I was a professor of psychology, it was very good way to get young students who are interested in psychology, but who are too young to have the insight that there's a lot of unconscious stuff going on, right? I mean, most people don't realize that until they get into the midlife crisis that,
Sure.
oh my God, there's something going on here. I
Right.
wasn't aware that. How did I end up in that same relationship 4 times?
Right. I'm
there
sorry,
be a-
I didn't mean to interrupt the
Oh,
flow
oh.
of your story. So you noticed
Oh,
this
no.
phenomenon about optical gazing and
Yeah. And I was using it to show to illustrate to my students that, your unconscious mind is amazing, so you can access it and so on.
Mhm.
And so in that context, I read this archaeological report by Soterios Dokaris, who was a classical archaeologist, and he had just looked in the sources on this Oracle of the Dead. It's right there in Herodotus, and a number of other people had written about it, but because it couldn't be, nobody had ever looked for it.
Right.
So he quickly found what apparently is the place and excavated it. And what they found there, the central apparition hallway was remnants of a large bronze cauldron. And so I knew at that time that, even in the Middle East today, they use a silver bowl, you polish it highly on the inside,
Right.
fill it with olive oil, and in the darkened room by candlelight, you gaze into this and you see these very vivid, three-dimensional, colored visions, and they take on a life of their own. Oh, it's not something you're commanding to appear, and so you can get very good at this and stay in these states for a long period of time. So as soon as I heard that detail about the cauldron, that's how it worked. I actually, later on, I consulted Dr. Dockers. I went to visit him. So, of course, I had to try it out. So set it up and thinking, well, if I do 50 of these,
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking I'd probably get like 5 people who actually saw something, and then I'd write paper.
Right.
And also my subjects were my graduate students were older folks, mostly. Some of them had already been out working in therapists or whatever, but coming back for further education.
Mm-hmm.
So it was a good group. And because these were very knowledgeable people about the mind.
Right.
So imagine my surprise when it worked on the first attempt.
Yes.
And not only that, it just never occurred otherwise to me that since these were people already trained in the mind, it never entered my mind that they might interpret it as a real event. But what I was expecting was they would say, oh, yeah, I saw this image. It looked like grandma, but was it real or was it a fit? I don't know.
A psychic projection due to active imagination.
That's what that's the attitude but no, from the very beginning, I saw my mother. It was really very assertive. And that's still to this day, Mark, the most oddest thing about this to me is that people take it to be a reality. And I understand when I tried it with my grandmother, I was trying to call up my cookie baking grandmother, and I got my frightening grandmother instead, which is, I later realized that was what I needed, right?
Right. I imagine such experiences are very cathartic on some level, aren't they?
Oh, yeah. And there's been a doctoral dissertation by a woman like forgot her name, at the Institute of Transpersonal Psychology, Annette, who studied the after effects of psychomanteum experiences as long as 5 years later. And even then, people said, look back on it as a positive event.
Do you attribute those events to a psychic projection, or do you think that on some level they were actually being called up? Because I'm thinking about Carl Jung's Red Book. Had you ever read it?
No, I haven't.
It reads like a journal of a man who's interested in delving into the depths of his own psyche, being that he's, researching other people's psyche. He wanted to know more about his own. He practiced what is now referred to as an active imagination. And as you said, these entities that were originally conjured up seemed to take on a life of their own. And he would then play the observer and begin a dialogue with them as if they were not psychic projections. And that led to a unique experience for him, I think, in the end result, in that he was able to self-actualize in a new way. He was moving into a new phase of his own life at that point in time. And I think there's something to that. I mean, on several planes of existence. I
absolutely think so, Mark. I mean, it's, the common sense view about what common sense is that common sense draws a very sharp, impermeable line between life and death, this life and the next life. But, in the lived reality of it, if you take people in general and you just take a broad swath of humanity, it's like I've known several people, for example, who had several cardiac arrests where they went to the afterlife kind of like several times. Or people who say that recurrently over a period of life, they've had a number of experiences with apparitions of departed loved ones and so on. So, in that broader view, which sort of comes with maturity, I think, it looks to me, that barricade or that barrier between this life and the world beyond is not quite as impermeable as common sense imagines.
Agreed. Regardless of what Aristophanes would have said.
Yeah.
So
right.
I need to invoke the psychologist in you, the psychiatrist in you. In your opinion, there's obviously a value in having these experiences from a psychological perspective, but I know also that there are pitfalls involved in this, and I'm sure you've run across those as well. What are your thoughts about that?
Well, just to speak very generally, there's something called the imposter phenomenon, and not the thing in pop psychology. This is a kind of mental disorder of someone who it has narcissistic and sociopathic features. And these people are incredibly engaging and charismatic. And they claim to be they tend to latch on to labels that the public regards as glamorous and to play that role. I did this and I did that.
Very glamorous.
And it's like one of the occasional things they find, which is a good story to keep as a near-death experience story, right? So, you always have to be on guard against that sort of individual. And my rough marker is beware if the person gives a positive answer to every single thing.
Amen.
When it's authentic, the people you ask them certain questions. Well, I don't know. I really didn't get to see that much. It's very modest, whereas the opposite would be a booming oh, yes, it's absolutely. That's what
absolutism is definitely a tell. I get that.
Exactly.
But with regards to people who are seeking such experiences, for instance, I've met a lot of psychologists and scientists in general who have had these types of experiences or were trying to find explanations for them or wanted to have them personally. And many people who have had such experiences, it sort of creates a psychic tension. So what's your secret to balancing the science of psychology and these mystical states And what would you advise to anybody who is looking to have these experiences?
Well, George Ritchie's one time mentioned to me, he said, a lot of these young people, he worked with young people being the university psychiatrist. He said, they listen to me and they say, why can't I have an experience like this? It just,
Right.
And George said, well, you ought to be happy that God didn't have to strike you dead.
I know exactly what you mean. Right. Sometimes you have to be smacked, and other times. Right.
That's right. And that's why you should, be happy that you didn't have to be smacked dead to get this information.
Right.
And, there can be a certain kind of enthusiasm for it, Mark, which is to its detriment.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's the most brilliant analysis of the afterlife problem ever written remains Plato's Phaedo.
Mm-hmm.
I remember reading that in, I'm pretty sure it was October of 1962,
okay,
and being swept away by this amazing document, which as I've lived life, I've seen just more and more how, oh my God, how wise. And one thing he emphasized was you got to be wary of thinking you know about this,
mm-hmm.
right? It's like you got to keep reinforcing with yourself is the seeming unknowability of this, and that's what I've always it's like, to me the thing is to look at the difficulties and objections. And I see in this field that you and I are sort of peripherally connected with a certain amount of demonizing, right, on that score. And whereas I think, well, to me, I want to be a critic. I mean, to look at this, every possible objection,
right,
to be thoroughly exposed and looking for objections,
right,
because that makes it most likely that that's the most likely scenario for me to get into the truth,
right,
which is what I want. And I have just never been able to understand people. They see something out there that they think they want, and then their strategy is to try to build a bridge of reasons and arguments to reach that. And to me, that is just, I can't imagine that being anything other than just misery. When I try to think of that activity,
yeah,
the fun of inquiry is to really put yourself to the test, put your own feet to the fire. Get it just like every single objection you can think of or find that anybody else made, to really explore it.
mm-hmm.
And in my quest for it, which is, as I mentioned to you, it's in that book, Making Sense of Nonsense.
Right.
What really just motivates me is things that don't make sense.
Mm-hmm.
And the profound spiritual component that has as well, not just in koans.
Right.
What is the sound of one hand clapping is nonsense question.
Right.
And the ABC books, which we now regard as entertainment for kids,
mm-hmm.
right? Those originated as a holy book, kind of. It was only for holy books, for communications with divine or conveying divine prophecies. There's about a dozen of them in the Old Testament alone. The charm of that format is that it combines ironclad certainty,
mm-hmm.
the order of the alphabet,
mm-hmm.
with the continuing element of surprise. You never can tell what's going to be under the next designation. You know what the letter will be, but not what the message will be.
Right.
So it's really, and so that's why they're so popular. But nowadays, it's gone over into the entertainment category. You go to Barnes and Noble, and my favorite one is Dr. Seuss decided, well, at a certain period, it was all apple to zebra, right? It was usually Z is for zebra at the end.
Right.
So Dr. Seuss's alphabet book is called On Beyond Zebra. And he says, in the places I go, there are things that I see that I never could spell if I stopped with the Z. I'm telling you this because you're one of my friends. My alphabet starts where your alphabet ends.
Brilliant. Brilliant. So the secret to balancing the science of psychology with mystical states might be encapsulated, if you'll excuse my very simplistic mindset that breaks things down, head in the clouds, feet on the ground, and curiosity as the string between the two of them, holding it all together.
Well, that sounds like fun. Yeah, it's fun is what it is for me, but it's not fun if people know when they're fooling themselves. It's dysphoria. Yeah. I say just be as rigorous as you can. Learn logic. Learn how to be rigorous, and it's fun. It's fun. And then what you come up with, you can be somehow better confidence than if you just sort of wanted to imagine the reasons why it might be. But where I've come to it is I am a skeptic in the Pyrrhonian sense. Mm-hmm. These people these days, Mark, who call themselves skeptics, they have no idea what that word means.
That's true. Very
true. Pyrrho said, after about 30 years after Aristotle, he knew logic very well. He said, well, logic is a scheme for generating conclusions for premises. So that's what works. What if we refrain from drawing a conclusion? Right. See, that's what. And he found that if they practice it assidually, it explodes your mind in a very interesting way. That's one of the reasons why I'm so weird today, is that I practiced this all my life. And also, if you think of it geometrically, everybody rushing in this way to get to the conclusion, but you avoid a conclusion, you see side pathways that everybody else missed in orienting that way. See, so I'm a skeptic, but and I realized the reasons that Hume and others gave for not, you can't draw a logical conclusion from that there is an afterlife. It's forbidden by the provisions of logic. But so, I'm fully, so it's not a logical conclusion. But where I am is I have given up. All my life, I've been able to think myself out of anything. And I just can't think my way out of it. It's to my astonishment, there is an afterlife. And I have no inclination or interest in trying to persuade anybody else of that. Somebody else could go by a different path, but I just give up. To my great surprise and astonishment, there is.
I know exactly what you mean. As I said, I'm a lifelong skeptic. My middle name is Thomas. My wife, who confuses the idea of skepticism with the modern day interpretation, often refers to me as Doubting Thomas. And I say, yes. And mind you, he's the one who walked on water.
That's right.
There's a value to doubt. Not discounting, but...
No, systemic doubt.
Right.
It's like to go through anything you approach thinking of the reasons why not.
Right.
It should be.
Right. The art of critical thinking and the art of science requires an open and discriminating mind.
Exactly.
I can't think of a better place to end the interview and to thank you so much, not only for the pleasure of your company, but for all of the time that you've given to us on this podcast. You have legions of fans, as you well know, and even though you don't strive to be famous, you are. I have questions from an audience. Do you have time to answer some of these questions? And the energy. Krista wants to know, what's your best response to the doubters who don't believe and say it's just wishful thinking or programmed expectation from religious thought? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I think, having talked with thousands of people, it's just far more complex than that. First of all, there is a kind of old saw out there in the community of doubters, as you call them, that this is all wishful thinking.
Right.
But the difficulty is from remote antiquity, there have been two major points of view of that. One is hatched by the Platonists, more or less, is that these things are indicators of an afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
But the other trend is that of Democritus, who said that this was just, we say today oxygen deprivation to the brain. He said he had figured out that things are made of atoms. So he said these near-death experiences, or it's the manifestation of the residual biological activity in the body. And the Epicurean thing came out of that. Epicurus was followed along in atomism. And that point of view, see, was that we don't want there to be an afterlife.
Mm-hmm.
For various reasons. Some people find it terrifying. So it's just not the fact that everybody wishes there to be an afterlife. My best friend for 30 years, Milton Friedman, not the great economist.
Mm-hmm.
Milton worked for the Senate and for various presidents, and he was, but he was interested in my work on near-death experiences. But at a certain point where it became to be, oh my God, there's something to this. He said, oh, I hope not. And there are people like that who just don't want there to be an afterlife. So it's more complicated than wishful thinking. And people have these experiences regardless of whether or not they were religious.
Yes.
Beforehand. Yeah,
right.
It makes little difference. It's no difference as far as I can tell whether they were or weren't religious.
Our mutual friend Robert Monroe being one of them. He wanted nothing to do with any of this. He thought it was all a bunch of bunk and a story until one day. Yeah. Nancy wants to know if you could design a research experiment with absolutely no limitations, what would it look like?
Well, I think it would be easily done. The trouble is that it is the presuppositions in what I call the afterlife establishment actually prevent us from genuine rational inquiry into life after death. But it can be done. And what it has to do is to acknowledge the objections that have been raised, the very real difficulties that have been raised by Plato, for example, and by David Hume and by A.J. Ayer, these great thinkers. And what they pointed out is the limitation is in Plato said that one of the big problems is what I call the narrative concept problem. And that is that we're all set up to love stories and just go, and we can listen to the stories of near-death experiences, which are very inspiring over and over. But what Plato said was, in addition to these experiential accounts, you've got to have some set of concepts to link the experiential narratives with the statement that there's an afterlife. And that's a major problem. And it still is today because people will just sit there forever and take in stories. But for many people, as soon as you start talking concepts, their eyes kind of roll up. See, I mean, if you're there for the narrative thrill of it and the inspiration, see, you might not be interested in going through the rigorous conceptual work that's needed to anchor it, is one problem. And then, as David Hume said, it's just incommensurable with our logic. The real deal, if you really think through it, is that the notion of an afterlife is a self-contradiction in its most blatant sense, and so not processable by logic. And Ayer, for example, and others pointed out that the words "there is life after death" convey feelings and emotions to us we may get, but to try to get to the cognitive content map is hopeless because, in that sort of point of view, see, the notion of an afterlife is unintelligible. Now, those are the real difficulties. And I say that they can easily be overcome. And I've already done it, actually. It's like if you augment people's minds in advance by adding a few principles of logical thinking where you shift to these principles when you come up with something that is unintelligible, like doesn't make any sense.
Right.
You can add to your mind where you can think logically about unintelligible, meaningless, or nonsense. When you trigger in your mind, you understand this. Then when you will subsequently have a near-death experience, you are able to understand why the common way of putting it is unintelligible. Because the common way of putting it is a travel narrative. But in order to be meaningful, a travel narrative includes space and time, right? But the presuppositions here is this is not space or time.
Right.
But knowing that in advance, somebody would say, well, I'm going to shift it this way so to make it clearer. And that's already happened. A really wonderful man, a sculptor and a distinguished scientist, took my seminar. Several years later, had a near-death experience with H1N1, lost his leg to gangrene.
Wow.
Had several near-death experiences during this hospitalization, but said, it's like, and Raymond, he said, while I was over there, he said, my mind went back to the seminar. He said, I realized that what you're saying is true, that you can't comprehend how that world is connected with this world. He said, unless you take the unintelligibility axis into account. And that's the real deal. And in answer to your question, that's exactly what I do. I would present this information, which I've taught. It goes back literally decades. I've been teaching this and steadily refining it. But it ended up being a full semester length course on how to think about things that are unintelligible, which was greatly received, but warmly received by attorneys, medical doctors, people who were in the field of advertising, just love.
Right.
Because it's nonsense that catches your attention.
That's right. It truly does.
Bada book, bada boom.
Are you still giving workshops and seminars? Are people, if somebody wants to get in touch with you, meet you in person, learn from you, how do they do that?
Well, there's a website, lifeafterlife.com, and I'm available there. I'm not so good at organizing things myself, but they have schedules there. And, due to the COVID crisis, I was off the road for a while, but it looks like it's starting back up tonight. Again, I'm going this summer to Lilydale in upstate New York.
Right.
Yeah, and my friend Eben Alexander will be there as well. So.
Raymond, I cannot tell you what an honor it's been for me to meet you, have this conversation with you. As I said earlier, you're a giant in this field, and I sincerely hope that you'll come and join us again for another interview.
Absolutely, and thank you so much, Mark, and thanks to all the folks who, listened in and just appreciate your spending this time with me.
Well, you're a real jewel, sir, and you have nothing but respect and love from me.
Thank you a million times. Love you.
Fine. Love you too. Thank you very much.
Be certain to tune in again to Expanding on Consciousness to become informed on the fascinating field of consciousness studies and its applications. The views and opinions expressed in this program are those of the guests and the host. They do not necessarily reflect the official policy or position of the Monroe Institute. Expanding on Consciousness is underwritten and produced by the Monroe Institute, copyright 2023, and is broadcast by permission. Reproduction or redistribution without the express written consent of Monroe Institute is prohibited by law. For more information about Expanding on Consciousness, visit our website at monroeinstitute.org or connect with us on the socials. Thank you for listening.